Good morning. In the fall quarter, which starts next Sunday, I'm going to be teaching the Gospel of John, so we'll just start a week early instead of doing some other topic for a week. The Gospel of John has a lot to cover anyway, so today we'll look at some introductory, some background material in John. Starting out with who wrote John. Now that might sound like an easy question. It's called John. But of course, we know that the early Gospels didn't have names on them except maybe on the outside of a scroll, and those scrolls are all lost. So the question is, do we believe all of the early Christian traditions that gave names, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, to it? It's not quite as obvious as when I was about second or third grade, my uncle asked me if I had studied history and some, and I said, well, just a little, I'm interested. And he said, okay, who's buried in Grant's tomb? Now, I had never heard of Grant's tomb. I was about third grade, and so I started thinking about it. Who's buried in Grant's tomb? And he started chuckling, and I didn't, what's he chuckling about? And eventually I figured it out that might be kind of obvious that maybe Grant is buried in Grant's tomb, but who wrote the Gospel of John? Well, the Gospels don't have explicit, this is from Matthew or Mark or Luke or John. And in those days, we mentioned they probably wrote on the outside of a scroll. And when they copied it, though, that might eventually not be copied, especially into a form besides a scroll. So you've got to look for two kinds of evidence. The external evidence comes from outside the Bible. The internal evidence comes from within the Bible. And the external evidence is, first of all of the early Christian sources refer to it as the Gospel of John, refer to John as the author of the fourth Gospel. Now, those are second century sources. There's no controversy about it. There's no debate about it in the second century. There's no other name proposed as an alternative in any of the early Christian sources. And of course, the Jews and the Romans and so on didn't even write about this. Frankly, no offense, they didn't care. You know, the Romans and the Jews weren't sitting around reading the Gospels and debating who wrote what and when. So the only external evidence we have is that it was John. Now, who's John? At one time, some scholars thought this gospel seems kind of Greek because of some of the topics that are touched upon. But more recent scholarship says, no, actually there's a very strong Jewish knowledge in the author. Of course, if the author were Greek, then it really couldn't be John, the fisherman from Galilee. But if it's got signs of Jewish knowledge that are explicit in what's written, then it could be. Now, some early Christian sources referred to the author as John the Elder. Well, who's that? Well, if you look at the beginning of the short epistles of 2 John and 3 John, the author identifies himself as John the Elder in those two epistles. But most scholars think that, you know, elder doesn't have to mean an office in the church. The word for elder was already a common word. It just means a man who's older. And a lot of scholars, and along with early Christians, believe that John, who didn't write until he was an old man, referred to himself as John the Elder because he was old. He was the oldest surviving apostle. And so that doesn't necessarily mean somebody separate from John of Galilee, brother of James, and so on. And if you think about it, why would early Christians accept a gospel that came from a John the Elder if that were a different person than John the Apostle? Because in the the Gospel of John and in the Epistle of 1 John, there's a very strong emphasis. I'm an eyewitness. I saw these things with my own eyes. The intro to 1 John is very explicit. The things that we saw with our eyes and heard with our ears and touched and felt with our hands, like the risen Jesus. If it's not John, one of the 12, then it would be a false claim to be an eyewitness. We don't know of any other John who would be an eyewitness to all of these things. So all the evidence points to John the Apostle. Now, when you go inside the Bible, you also get some internal evidence. There's very similar Greek vocabulary and style across those three epistles of John and the Gospel of John. John seems to emphasize Jesus as the light in contrast to the darkness. Jesus is the light of the world. And he comments himself as the narrator in his gospel that Jesus was the light. And the darkness shuns the light. And then he repeats that kind of theme in 1 John in particular. So you can see a common authorship among these books. And there are explicit claims to being an eyewitness. So what it all adds up to is it's the Apostle John. Because some other John the Elder wouldn't have all this eyewitness testimony to offer. When did John write this? Well, we can piece together some evidence on that also. He doesn't actually quote directly from Matthew, Mark, or Luke, but some of the phrases he uses seem to come from Mark. So we think he was aware of Mark. He had read Mark and made reference to Mark. So he would have come at least after Mark. But we also see some interesting evidence that John is assuming that we've already read those other Gospels and that we already know certain things and that he doesn't have to explain them to us. For example, John chapter 3, verse 24, backing up to verse 23, it says, John also was baptizing in Enon near Salim, because there was plenty of water there. People were coming and being baptized, since John had not yet been thrown into prison. Now, the author of the Gospel of John doesn't stop and explain what he's talking about. He just says, since John had not yet been thrown into prison. So what's he assuming from his readers? They're already familiar with the fact that John the Baptist got imprisoned by Herod Antipas, right? He doesn't have to stop and explain. Well, as we're going to see, he wrote pretty late. He wrote after the other Gospels. He probably wrote in the early 80s AD. And I don't think he was depending on people's memory 50 years later that John the Baptist had been in prison. I think he was depending on the fact that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were out there being copied and circulated and studied. Therefore, everybody already knew John the Baptist was in prison. He doesn't have to go through the whole story again and explain it. And he writes this way in a lot of ways. And at the end of this long chapter 6, he makes reference to the 12. Now, what does that phrase mean? Well, it's the 12 Galilean disciples who were his inner circle, who later became known as the 12 apostles when they were sent out, right? But up to this point in the Gospel of John, he hasn't listed them. He hasn't gone through all the stories of all of them being called by Jesus like you find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Suddenly the phrase the 12 shows up and they've never been listed. Well, because they were already, he doesn't have to repeat everything that's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He can assume that his readers know something about it. And as we'll see next week, I think one of the purposes of the Gospel of John was kind of advanced teaching. The fundamentals of the gospel are already understood from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And what John wants to do is teach about the difficult to understand things. The book of John is full of things that, with explicit indications, Jesus said this and we didn't understand at the time. Only later, after the resurrection and so on, only later did we come to understand. And so as a result, John is going to teach, assuming that you know the basic gospel outline, and then he's going to teach different things than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He's going to teach harder things than that. And one of the important sequences, Jesus' arrest and his trials, his interrogations, his crucifixion, John omits discussing Jesus being taken before Caiaphas the high priest before he was taken to Pilate, the Roman governor. Now that's a pretty important thing in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But John just kind of skips right over it. But he can do that because he can assume you already know from Matthew, Mark, and Luke that this happened. And his job is not to repeat everything that's already found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And be thinking about this. We'll discuss it at the end and next week. From your knowledge coming in, what is different in your mind about the Gospel of John? What makes Gospel of John have a different feel, a different flavor to you than Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Because it seems obvious that he wasn't writing another Matthew, Mark, or Luke. We didn't need a fourth version that repeats all the same stories and so on. That wasn't his goal. So early Christian law, we go to the external evidence. The internal evidence is he assumes the other three Gospels are already written and you already know about them. But the external evidence is also that, according to the second century Christian authors, John's Gospel was the last one written. And the other three Gospels, when we date them and we move back and we look at dates that we can trace in history, like in the book of Acts, and we know that the book of Luke was written by the time the book of Acts was written and so on, so we can confine, we end up saying probably the early 60s AD is when Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written. So when was John written? Well, sometime after that. But that could be any time in the 70s or 80s. One early Christian who had knowledge passed down into the second century said that John wrote during the reign of the Emperor Domitian. Now, Domitian ruled from 81 to 96 AD, and John apparently died while Domitian was emperor. Domitian was apparently the emperor who exiled John to the island of Patmos, where he wrote his final book, Revelation. So we can kind of start moving backwards. If John died in the early to mid-90s, then that places a limit on when John would have been written. But, and we'll get into this in future weeks, it would seem that when John wrote some of these difficult to understand things that were not understood at the time Jesus said them, and when he talked about these advanced topics, there were some people, and we talked last spring about the dualists, for example, the people who believe that everything in the material world is evil, and therefore they became heretics and said Jesus couldn't really have a body, He must have just been a spirit, and so on. John wrote to counter them, but the dualists, the heretics, twisted some of the things that John wrote in the Gospel of John. And so 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John seem to have been written to clear up, to combat heresy, to combat misinterpretations of the Gospel of John, among other things. So if John dies in the early to mid-90s, and before he writes Revelation, he writes 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John to clear up misconceptions, heretical interpretations, then that means the Gospel of John has to be out there and have a few years to get misinterpreted before he can write those. So we're confining now, we're kind of backing up in time. We're saying it's after the 60s, but it's before the 90s, but it's within Domitian's reign from 81 to 96, so that leaves us with the 80s. Probably the early 80s is when we would have it. Now, an outline of the book of John is going to look different from an outline of the other Gospels. John starts out with this interesting passage. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And for the first 14 verses of John chapter 1, he's on this theme of the Word of God. And the Word, we discussed last spring, was the Greek word logos, which could mean message, or the way that God communicates with us, the go-between, the mediator between God and men. And this was a conception, the logos, that came from Greek philosophy. And John was saying Jesus is superior to the Greek version of this. The Greek version of the logos was created by a creator, so he didn't exist forever. He wasn't there in the beginning. The logos in Greek philosophy was a created being who then went on to create us. But look at what John does in verse 1. In the beginning was the logos. So that already contradicts the Greek conception. And in the spring we looked at the fact that the Greek conception was picked up by some Jews who tried to mix it with Judaism. In the beginning was the logos, the Word of God. And the logos was with God. And then the clincher, he's not an inferior being. Not only was he not created, because he's there in the beginning, the Word, the logos, was God. So this is a statement of the Trinity. This is the Son of God and the Father are equal. Jesus is God. The Father is God. The Holy Spirit is God. And so John is starting out with this intro in chapter 1 to the logos. That's very different, right, from any other gospel. Then the rest of chapter 1, John spends talking about the testimony of John the Baptist about Jesus. Then we get 3 chapters where, if you read carefully, as we will, John is showing how Jesus challenged some of these old Jewish rituals. He challenged the ritual conceptions that they had in these 3 chapters. Then we have a half a dozen chapters that's really kind of interesting. This is one of the themes of John, the festivals of the Jews, and how Jesus was the prophetic fulfillment of these festivals. Obviously the Passover, right? Because Jesus is the new Passover lamb. He's the new sacrifice as opposed to an animal sacrifice. But even the other festivals, like the Day of Atonement, Jesus is the new atonement for sin, the new permanent atonement. And as a result of this festival emphasis, something interesting happens in John. Now let's back up a bit and look at Mark. I think that the basic outline of Mark is followed by Matthew and Luke. And Mark is the preaching of Peter in Rome to Gentiles. And if you were to outline the Gospel of Mark, it would look kind of like this. Jesus has a big Galilean ministry. Up in Galilee, he engages in all these teachings and works all these miracles and healings. And then at the end of his life, he comes down to Jerusalem. And while he's there, he does things that openly challenge the Jewish leaders. He basically provokes his own crucifixion because it's intentional. It's part of the plan for Jesus to be crucified. So Jesus comes down and provokes his own crucifixion through his conflict in Jerusalem at the end of his life. But in John, you have Jesus making multiple trips to Jerusalem. Now, that actually makes sense because Jews made pilgrimages to Jerusalem for the festivals, right? And in 3.5 years, Jesus isn't going to go one time to Jerusalem. Every Jew is going to go several times in a period of years. But when Peter was preaching in Rome to the Gentiles, who don't know anything about Jewish festivals, nor do they particularly care, he preaches kind of a simplified outline of Jesus' life, which communicates two things that are very, very true. First of all, most of Jesus' ministry is in Galilee. And when you think about it, and this actually just occurred to me yesterday, why is most of Jesus' ministry in Galilee? Well, he doesn't want to provoke his death until the time comes. And when you're in Galilee, you don't have all the leaders of the Jews there. They're not going to grab you and kill you in the first year of your ministry. If you do all of your ministry up in Galilee, then you can choose when to provoke them later. Right? And in fact, his early trips to Jerusalem kind of came and went quickly, as we see in John. So one of the great truths is, yes, Jesus focused his ministry in Galilee, and that's reflected in the preaching of Peter in the Gospel of Mark. His teachings, his miracles were in Galilee primarily. And the second great truth that Peter communicates is, at the end of his life, Jesus intentionally came to Jerusalem seeking his own death, seeking the final conflict with the Jewish leaders, because that was the plan. And so that's communicated in Mark. And one of the ways it's communicated is by omitting any other trips of Jesus to Jerusalem. Galilee, and then end of his life, the last 6 chapters of Mark are all Jerusalem, the last few months of his life. Matthew and Luke kind of followed the same outline. But John has a different purpose for his gospel. He wants to bring out some theological truths that are a little bit more advanced. And one of them is Jesus interacted with all of these Jewish festivals. And he declared himself to be the fulfillment of them. And he had to do that through multiple trips to Jerusalem in his lifetime, which are reflected in the book of John. And then this outline that I'm following lists 11 chapters, half the book, as being a death and resurrection testimony. But you'll notice it starts with chapter 11. Whose death and resurrection are we talking about in chapter 11? Not Jesus yet. Who dies in chapter 11 and gets resurrected? Lazarus. And so there's a whole section here that's all about death and resurrection and the conquering of death by Jesus. And so it's a different approach than we see in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. What do you notice, just from your reading over the years, what do you notice makes Gospel of John so different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke? What, has it ever jumped out at you that this just feels different, this looks different? Right, it goes off on some stories of not quite as much of his doing as you might find in Mark, for example. There's a lot of stories when you line up the Gospels in parallel, there's a lot of stories that are in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and you don't see them in John. But then again, John knew that you already had Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So why get into those, you know? So next week we'll take a look at the ways in which John is different and also think about why. Why did he make his gospel so different? What can we figure out about his purpose from looking at that? So that's where we'll pick up next time.